In Weimar, today a sleepy town a few hours from Germany's major cities, you can still feel the pride in the Dichter und Denker who once called it home, Goethe and Friedrich Schiller, above all others. But look at the bus timetable at Goetheplatz in the town centre, and you'll see that the end of the line is Buchenwald. It's a place where normal life sits alongside the horrors of Germany's 20th century, a tension at the heart of Katja Hoyer's new history of interwar Germany, Weimar, Life on the Edge of Catastrophe. I'm Alastair Benn, Deputy Editor of Engelsberg Ideas, and I'm delighted she's here to talk about it. Katja, welcome.
Thank you, Alastair.
You begin the book, in a sense, at the end, with a scene of Weimarers being forced by occupying US army troops to see what had happened at Buchenwald, one of Germany's largest concentration camps just a few kilometres from the town centre. Could you give an idea of Buchenwald's setting?
Yes, so what struck me about that is just what you said, how close it is to the town centre, to ordinary life. So you basically have this really picturesque, lovely town of Weimar, very green, surrounded by parks, elegant villas, cobbled streets. It's kind of like what you imagine Germany in an idealised form to be. And then the Buchenwald concentration camp is just on a hill outside. It's basically walking distance. It's a sort of short hike up the hill and you'd get there. And that juxtaposition is one of those things that really struck me about that setting and why I think it's such an interesting place to go to when you want to understand what happened to Germany in the interwar period.
So you also begin with a man called Karl Weirich's testimony of that day. He's a bookbinder whose diary entries are threaded throughout the text. How does his life reflect Weimar's journey?
Yeah, so I started with him because in a way the fact that he was confronted with that history personally by the Americans who said to 1,000 Weimarers, him included, Karl, that they should walk up that short distance from Weimar to the concentration camp and see for themselves before it gets cleared up what they'd lived next to. And the Americans deliver these sort of lectures in Buchenwald to the people there, and they say, this is your responsibility, this is what you tolerated at best, if not even facilitated. And Karl reflects on that in his diary, and so I figured it was a good starting point, because he says that his heart filled with shame and disgust at our German downfall, as he puts it. So there is a degree of understanding that this is Germany's responsibility. But what also struck me is he keeps this diary over years, even after the war, and there's no reflection really on his personal or collective responsibility as a citizen of Weimar, as a citizen of Germany. And so for me, this question is sort of, were the Americans right to say that ordinary Germans like him have got a personal responsibility for what happened or not? And so I then kind of go back and follow Karl from the moment he moved to Weimar in 1914 to set up his shop, all the way through this history as a central human strand to that story.
So, I mean, we can go back now to Germany's new beginning, in a sense, in 1919. So Germany's now a democracy. Why is Weimar chosen to host Germany's first National Assembly?
Yeah, so the logical place would have been Berlin. It was the capital of the previous German empire. It was also, before that, the capital of Prussia. It really is the political center of Germany, so that would have been the logical choice. But Berlin wasn't safe. There was communist upheaval that was brutally crushed by the so-called Freikorps troops, so basically veterans, mostly kind of between conservative and far right, really cracking down on those uprisings. It's not the place in Berlin where you want to sit down and have a deep think and discussion about the future of your country. So they look for alternatives, and Weimar pretty quickly tops the list for various reasons. One is just a pragmatic one. It's almost exactly in the center of Germany, therefore really easy to get to. But more importantly, it's also seen by many people as the cultural heart of the country. So you alluded in your introduction to the poets Goethe and Schiller, who are perhaps comparable to what Shakespeare is, I suppose, to the English-speaking world, like the national poets. You had composers like Bach and Liszt who lived there, the philosopher Nietzsche. It's really kind of a who is who of European thought and culture that's associated with that place. And the idea of rebranding Germany, as this kind of nation of culture, of culture, was quite appealing. You could kind of give this name the spirit of Weimar, as it was referred to at the time. and inject this new Germany with it, and that appealed to many people as well at the time. That's why they go there.
I mean, on a personal note, my middle name is actually Frederick, after Friedrich Schiller.
There you go.
So my mum is an expert on Schiller. So Weimar has left its legacy on my life. But yeah, so how did Weimarers react to the goings on at the new National Assembly?
Well, Weimar was quite a sleepy conservative town. It sort of really wallowed in this cultural legacy. Tourists would come, but the town itself has only got 35,000 people in it, so it's small and safe and picturesque. And then suddenly you get this political circus turn up. So basically all the politicians, the journalists, the attendant staff, the secretaries. There's an airline, the first civilian airline is established between Weimar and Berlin so that they can move all the correspondence sort of back and forth and newspapers and things like that. And that's quite the spectacle when you think, there's no kind of aerial traffic yet. And then suddenly these planes get landed by World War I fighter pilots, the kind of earliest incarnation of that, because it's a really difficult maneuver to land them. And all of this is a huge spectacle. And some Weimarers hate it. They think their life's being disrupted. Karl Weyrich, the bookbinder, grumbles a bit in his diary about not being able to leave because there's a military cordon around Weimar because they're worried about communists disturbing the whole thing. But some people also, and I would say that's probably the majority, are just really excited about it. I've got one example of a little girl who sort of plays National Assembly with her toys because her aunt took her along to one of the sessions, and she sees all the shouting, and British listeners will know what I'm talking about. You kind of get this raucous political spectacle, and she's fascinated by that. You can get tickets, so if you're an ordinary citizen, you can go and see the sessions. That's quite exciting. And the National is now still called the German National Theatre, which was previously the Court Theatre in Weimar. Is also right in the town centre. It's got 2 statues of Goethe and Schiller in front of it. The symbolism is just brilliant. And so to many Weimarers, this certainly becomes a bit of a focal point of their life at that time.
And 1919 is important in another respect. It's the year also Gropius founds the Bauhaus movement in Weimar. How does that fit in?
Yeah, that's another interesting move from Berlin to Weimar, because Gropius is a very, even at the time already an established Berlin-based architect, very promising young talent. He could have said, I want to set up my movement in the most liberal and arty place in Germany, which is Berlin. And he also decides to go to stuffy, conservative, pristine Weimar to do that. I think partially it's the same idea really, to relaunch a new way of living, building, doing art from Germany's cultural centre. That's an appealing thought. And I think the other one, Gropius being who he was, he loved to provoke and, really kind of put his finger in it when the cultural backlash, as far as the cultural backlash is concerned to his movement. And he said the moment he arrived, he wrote in a letter that he'd poked this hornet's nest of kind of conservative backlash. Maybe just to paint a bit of a picture here, the students are quite almost like proto-hippie-esque. So when they first move in, they wear these long coats. They're called Russian aprons or Russian coats, these kind of sandals to go with it. They look quite hippie-esque. They go skinny dipping in the river, and you can just imagine this kind of, cultural elite, or the boring old fuddy-duddies, as he calls them, not really enjoying that very much. So you get immediately that cultural clash, and I think that's deliberately what he wanted, because it gets, his movement in the news and talked about.
And all that plays out against, you alluded to it, against the violence of Germany's street politics, like armed gangs, paramilitaries, and assassinations. So was Weimar spared the worst of that?
Yeah, that was part of what made it attractive in that time, is because it's quite middle class. It only has one factory which produces sort of like train wagons, carts. So it's only got a few hundred workers. It's not really a town where you get a lot of kind of rising of the proletariat kind of thing. I've got one scene in the book, that so-called German Revolution that topples the Kaiser in 1918. There's a mini version of that unfolding in Weimar, and the workers are so isolated they don't even know like the Internationale or any of the other kind of working class songs, so they all stand there, they gather for this revolution, and then nobody really knows how to do that because they've never been schooled in sort of Leninist thought, and so you don't get that sort of level of violence there. It's quite interesting. One of the reports I found was from a journalist from the New York Times, and he said, in contrast to Berlin today, Weimar is lovely, clean, and well organized. And I thought, yeah, Weimar would probably still say that about itself today. Not much has changed in that regard.
So, I mean, that's a great picture of that kind of opening, sets the stage. Did hyperinflation kill off some of the optimism of those early years, that sense of some kind of rebirth?
Yeah, I think so. And people forget how much enthusiasm there was in 1919 because, again, we look at it from hindsight and we can't really change that. So I'm under no illusion that people are going to go in there and approach this completely with a blank mind because we can't. But if you try and imagine for a moment 1919, that moment of the first free, open elections, women can vote for the first time, and they do in large numbers. They go to these political education meetings, which I found quite a strange little side story, where basically older men and political experts tell women how to be a citizen effectively, how to vote, how this all works, what the different parties do. So there's real enthusiasm, and the turnout is quite large as well, as in sort of, way north of 80%, which when you compare it to today's figures is enormous. And that indeed, once hyperinflation and also even the crises in between, you got on the right, you got the Kapp putsch, so there's a right-wing attempt to try and overthrow the government. You've got constant left-wing upheaval in the rural region and in Leipzig and elsewhere where you've got large amounts of workers. So there's unrest all the time. And I try and capture this in the book, what that actually means on the ground. So suicide rate, for example, goes up massively in Weimar specifically, but also across Germany. You have homelessness for the first time. Weimar really isn't used to that sort of level of destitution because it's not an urban space. So from the beginning, it's not great. And people are waiting for that to settle. And then hyperinflation basically completely pulls out the rug from under people's feet. Karl writes in his diary he bought a used bicycle for something like 2 million marks for his wife who couldn't even ride a bicycle, but he says I might as well, because if he'd waited another few months he would have got an egg or a loaf of bread for the same money. And so that's when you run a small shop and you're paying rent rather than owning outright, as Germans mostly do. It's a really disconcerting experience and could have very easily broken the Republic there and then.
You have already mentioned him, but one thinker does loom over Weimar in the interwar periods, Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived out his last years of madness there, and his sister Elisabeth Fürsten Nietzsche. She's a central figure in your book. How did she shape and distort his legacy?
Yeah, she is an interesting figure because she has got an interesting backstory. She married an anti-Semitic teacher way in the late 19th century, and they moved to South America to found an Aryan-only colony called Nueva Germania, where sort of Aryans were supposed to be able to live amongst themselves, and that project, maybe unsurprisingly, failed, and her husband poisoned himself in a hotel room. And then the moment she returns to Germany, her brother is not only become incapacitated and gone mad, but also become famous. And her decision to do something with that legacy is partially money driven, because after all, she's now a widow, female, alone, has nothing. So using her brother's legacy seems a way to do that. And an even better way to do that is to take him to Weimar. They have no connection to Weimar as such. I mean, they don't come from there. They come from a small place called Röcken outside of Leipzig. So she drags her incapacitated brother to Weimar so that he can live out his last mad days there and die there in 1900, and then builds up a Nietzsche archive. And this is really where her legacy comes in, because Nietzsche's writing, as people may know, is very fragmentary, is kind of individual bits and notes and aphorisms, and she deliberately decides to pick and choose bits and put them together into a more coherent format. And that makes Nietzsche, on the surface, more accessible. People can find a more coherent thought process there than he'd intended. But equally, it opens itself up to lots of distortion. She never allows scholars at the time complete access to the original notes and things, but only says kind of, here are my copies of it, and then she tightly controls who gets access to it and in what form. But this is really when you see a Nietzsche cult developing, and she financially and politically benefits from that. Yeah,
and the kind of the desire to finance it leads her into a more uncomfortable, closer relationship with the far-right circles.
Yeah, she needs state funding effectively, and that in the state of Thuringia, of which Weimar is the capital, you get really unstable governments. You get at first a kind of left-wing one, a coalition between the communists and the socialists, and they're quite wary of Nietzsche. They do fund it, but they're quite wary of him, and so it changes how much money they put in and get out of this project. And then later on you get kind of almost none of the Thuringian governments actually stay in place for very long. You get more conservative and then eventually far-right governments, and she realizes that concepts like the will to power, the superhuman, they lend themselves to far right appropriation, and that's exactly what happens in the end. She's actually a bigger fan of Mussolini to start
she's sort
with.
of seduced by him, fascinated by him.
I think she thinks of him as the more like cultivated, the more well-read leaders. Like, she finds the Nazis a bit uncouth and a bit sort of barbarian in there, not least because the violence is so obvious of their movement in Germany. And Mussolini also said in an interview once that Nietzsche was one of his big inspirations, and she immediately realizes that this is a really kind of golden way in for her to make her movement or her own kind of brother's ideas politically valid, and so she tries to befriend him basically via letters and things, and he starts co-funding the archive a bit as well.
Yeah, so as you show, Weimar is absolutely central in a way to the Nazi movement in organisational terms and personally for Adolf Hitler himself. I mean, how did that come about?
So one reason is that Hitler just loved Weimar. Personally, he was really intrigued by it, and he actually said to one of his local lieutenants, I just love Weimar, and this kind of exclamation. It's quite rare that you get that raw sort of emotion from him, and he's really attached to it. You can see sometimes, because it is halfway roughly between sort of Munich and Hamburg, and therefore on the way to Berlin, every time he travels back and forth, he sometimes just stops in Weimar on the train and just gets out and spends a couple of days there, going walking, sitting in the cafes. Even later on, as he becomes more famous or infamous, he never has the places cleared or anything, where elsewhere he's got sort of security concerns that communists might come in and try and assassinate him or disturb the meetings. He never ever has that problem in Weimar because it's so sedate and also quite sympathetic early on to his movement. So that's one reason. The other is that politically it's quite convenient for him. So when he tries to push his way into power in 1923, the Nazi Party has a nationwide ban against it after that, because it's seen as a sort of dangerous revolutionary party. And in Weimar, in Thuringia, the Nazi candidates just stand as independent candidates or under a different party name. They basically just circumvent that. So you get 7 of them. Not a lot, but there are 7 MPs in the Thuringian parliament that are kind of pro-Nazi. And they are needed for a right-wing conservative majority. And so they make a deal and they say, fine, we'll tolerate your government, but only if you re-legalize the Nazi party in Thuringia, and they do that in 1924. So this is the only spot at the time where the Nazi party can legally act and gather and organize events and things like that, and that also makes it quite an attractive kind of launch pad for the Nazis to reconsolidate once Hitler comes out of prison.
Just before we get into the kind of Nazi rise to power, I found those comments about how Hitler saw Weimar very intriguing. I mean, his favourite hotel, the Hotel Elefant, is in Weimar. And it struck me that Weimar for him is just a place of leisure. And it's really different to Bayreuth, which is a sort of shrine and a place of pilgrimage. And the kind of Wagner cult is completely different. And I guess Nietzsche plays a slightly different role in the kind of Nazi system than Wagner. So he sort of found Weimar comforting. Yeah,
it's strange as well that the figures so associated with Weimar don't really do anything for Hitler. It's a really strange thing. He reads Goethe and Nietzsche and Schiller. He does a lot of that in prison actually as well, because he's trying to work out intellectually where to take the movement. And it just doesn't chime with him. I mean, he does go later on to all the big anniversaries and shows his face, like the Schiller anniversary is particularly telling. He kind of just turns up at the theatre in a suit, which is quite rare for him, but he doesn't say anything. He doesn't stage the show. He leaves all of that to Goebbels, who's a academic philologist and therefore much more into that sort of stuff. Also relying on Baldur von Schirach, the future Hitler Youth leader, who's from Weimar, and also quite a central character in my book. And because he's from Weimar, he also studies German studies in Munich. Those figures try and convince Hitler that this is a useful legacy to tap into, but he never really fully commits to it. You're right, Bayreuth is the place, because he's so obsessed with Wagner, that he sees as the cultural heart of Germany. Weimar is nice and he likes it, he loves it emotionally, but it's not the place that he sees personally as central to the movement.
And I guess it as you say, Thuringia is really important in the Nazi story. So did it kind of serve as a template for how the Nazis were to win national power?
Yeah, it was seen as a Experimentierfeld, like a field of experimentation for the Nazis, where they could try out early ideas, and that's really telling when you see some of the patterns unfolding quite early. So the first formal Nazi party rally before they moved to Nuremberg is held in Weimar in 1926, and maybe we can talk about that a bit more. But it's just one example, really. So later on in 1930, you get the first government with a Nazi minister in it, regional government, also in Weimar. And that's not any person. Hitler parachutes Wilhelm Frick into Weimar as the minister for the interior and for culture and education. And he will later on become the national minister of interior for Nazi Germany from 1933 onwards. So he directly takes his experiences from Weimar and from Thuringia and what worked and didn't work there to the national stage later on and implements things there.
And he takes his earlier life. I mean, Frick was a kind of thuggish operator. Yeah. From that street politics, that kind of vicious
indeed,
street
and that's
politics.
quite interesting because it shouldn't work with people like Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who initially really sort of thinks it's a bit uncouth getting somebody like that in there, and he's not the sort of person that you invite for tea and have discussions over philosophy with. And then she does invite him, though, because she needs money and she wants him to bankroll the Nietzsche archive. And then he sort of bit by bit adapts to her style and to her personality and tries to win her over for the cause. She never actually joins the Nazi party. He's trying to get her to do that. But it is quite telling how the Nazis, perhaps certainly better than the communists and certainly better also than a lot of the other movements at the time, managed to adapt their messaging, their style, their whole offering according to which particular social class and group and also gender they're talking to.
It's incredibly ruthless and, clever. Yeah. You talked about that first big rally in 1926. Did that feel to Weimarers, in retrospect, like a kind of taste of what was then to come? Sort
of. I mean, Weimar is also a conference town. It still is today, again, for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. So Weimarers are well used to all sorts of movements coming for a weekend and doing their thing. They'd already seen a massive nationalist rally, kind of where Hindenburg and Ludendorff and that sort of old nationalist right-wing sentiment played a centre stage. Hitler was still in prison at the time. And that was huge. It was kind of a German day where they were trying to rally all the kind of right-wing and far-right groups. And so these things happen. They also had a socialist congress of the young socialists. It's very strange that Weimar attracts all these different kind of groups and ideologies. So in the context of that, it doesn't seem completely out of place. But what does make it special is the abject and sheer violence that surrounds this event. I mean, you have street brawls everywhere. You have people being beaten into hospital. The Nazis try and storm the local headquarters of the trade union and left-wing movements, the Volkshaus, and try and set it on fire. A policeman is shot on the open street right in front of the train station. And Weimar, as being conservative and middle class, find this absolutely abhorrent. There's a little town council meeting afterwards where they collectively swear that they will never allow the Nazis to do that again to Weimar, and the mayor says they came as visitors, how dare they behave like that. There's absolute outrage. And yet, just a few, weeks later, you get the next event. It's quite telling, though, that they can see all of this and they realize how bad it is. Same again in 1930 when you get the first kind of Nazi-dominated government there, and they can see what it does to education, to policing, to everything. And yet, it doesn't seem to be enough to dissuade enough people to think that this is maybe not the way to go.
Yeah, well, Weimar does seem to be kind of an early stronghold of Nazi support. And one of the most vivid contemporary observers is Harry Graf Kessler, who's a cosmopolitan diplomat, art patron and diarist, and he was based in Weimar and a friend of Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. He was both conservative, although pro-democracy, and repelled by the Nazis. But how did he react to their popular success in Weimar?
Yeah, I mean, he was quite a liberal. He even had a little socialist phase despite being an aristocrat, and they called him the Red Count. He's also Anglo-German, so he's got that English lineage as well, and has got a lot of friends in England, spends a lot of time here as well, and because of that, he's an interesting character because he comes in and out and sees kind of what's going on in a kind of strobe light effect, where each time he comes back something has changed, especially his friend Elizabeth, and he gets increasingly frustrated with her. But what I found remarkable is that they stay friends, and this is such an interesting tension between them where they write letters to each other and they meet in person at the Nietzsche archive, because Kessler has got a house in Weimar as well, and always saunters up the hill to have coffee with her and then comes back and rants about it in his diary. And he's such an outrageous kind of dandy sort of character as well, so there's this real
He's a great writer.
He is, there's a real sense of kind of bitter irony but also quite funny wit in his writing. And he's, from the beginning, he's absolutely appalled by both the Nazis and also Mussolini's movement. They have a debate at one point, him and Elizabeth, about whether Mussolini is what Nietzsche had envisioned as a kind of greater human. Is he this kind of big intellectual that can lead other people? And he actually gets really angry with Elizabeth at this point and says to her, like, how can you think that this is the personification of what Nietzsche wanted when he's suppressing intellectual debate, intellectual thought in this country? He's kind of suppressing the greater humans that Nietzsche wanted to see and come to the fore. And Elizabeth actually like wavers for a moment. She'd already written a letter to Mussolini, and thus it's on his desk, and she sits there and she thinks, have I already sent this? You know, she writes this later on in a letter to Kessler, and then she's trying to think, should I adapt this maybe and be a little bit less fawning? But in the end, she sort of goes with her own instincts and follows that.
Yeah, it's quite a sort of wretched spectacle. But if you want to be, if there's any kind of sympathy you can feel for her, is this sense that she's just yearning for the world of her youth all the time.
Yeah, she's completely out of time, and in that she's very representative of her generation. So maybe we should put this in a bit of context. She's in her 70s at this point, approaching 80, and in the book she turns 80 as well. So she's old, and really comes from a time, she says this herself often in letters, when we had Bismarck and the Kaiser, and she kind of looks back to all of that as the great days of Germany, and she wants something like that back. She regularly meets with the so-called Empress, so this is Kaiser Wilhelm II's wife, Hermine, whom he married in exile, so it's not like she was actually married to him when he was the Kaiser, but still calls herself the Empress and holds these like teas and things and pretends that they're holding court. And she often comes to the Nietzsche archive, and Elizabeth absolutely revels in that and thinks, this is the Empress who comes to visit me. And she wants something like that back, but knows very soon that there's no possibility of restoring the monarchy. So she goes for the next best thing in her imagination, and that's Mussolini as a dictator.
So when the Nazis had one kind of national power, how did Weimar specifically fit into their grand plans for Germany?
So it loses a little bit of importance in the sense that it was a launch pad for them, and now that they are in power, basically it loses that role because they don't need it anymore. It's also too small for a lot of the stuff. So they do hold one rally that's got over 100,000 people attending in a town of 35,000 people, and it's huge, and the papers kind of say this is the biggest thing that people of Weimar have ever seen, and that's true. But when you think of the scale of the Nuremberg rallies and, what you can do in places like Munich, Hamburg, Berlin, it loses a little bit of that. And as we said earlier, it's also not got quite the cultural importance to Hitler personally that Bayreuth has. Nonetheless, he carries on visiting. Every time he does, he visits Elizabeth, Förster Nietzsche, and tries to sort of make use of the Nietzsche legacy, even though he doesn't personally fully believe in it. And Weimar also becomes a so-called Gau capital. So these districts that the Nazis divide Germany into, they're called Gau, and each Gau has got a capital, and in this case it's Weimar for Thuringia. And it's supposed to become a Nazi model town, and so from the beginning they come up with new architectural plans for it. So they want to Nazify the architecture there, the culture, and everything, and it's supposed to sort of become a model town. So, for example, also the first institute of racial science, if you want to call it that, where the Nazis try and dig into people's ethnic background and to see if they have any Jewish or foreign sort of lineage in their family history. That is also set up in Weimar. So really the kind of whole drive towards eugenics, towards this kind of pseudoscience of race that they build up, is also really at home in Weimar during that time. Yeah,
I know what you mean, that if you think of the opening stages of Leni Riefenstahl's film The Triumph of the Will, that works for Nuremberg in a way, the plane coming out of the clouds and the kind of the spectacular, the use of spectacle, this kind of collision of modernity and tradition, all these things. And Weimar wouldn't have looked like that way.
It's just too small and too oldie worldy. I mean, it's nice, and that's why Hitler likes it, but it has got that coziness to it. And even when they eventually plant these kind of giant, great big Nazi party buildings in there that are built in the new architecture, they feel out of place. Whilst in Nuremberg, they've got enough space to sort of juxtapose that next to the old town centre of Nuremberg, which is also very medieval. But there is just enough room to do that on scale, and that just doesn't work in Weimar because it's so central and small and quite concentrated.
It is still really strange when you go down from the station Weimar, and it is one of the first landmarks, is what would have been the Gau Forum, and this kind of really dry neoclassical big open space.
Yeah, that was done deliberately. So Hitler wanted it to be... So maybe we should briefly explain that. So each of the Gau capitals was supposed to get a Gau Forum, which is a local Nazi party headquarters. So this would normally have some office buildings, a great big people's hall where you can get sort of 70, 80,000 people in for events, and then a clock tower with sort of, you know, almost like a kind of Germanic rune kind of theme to it on the inside. The kind of styling of them was supposed to be the same, and then each Gau capital, Dresden was one of them, for example, Hamburg and so on, they were all supposed to get one. The only one that was ever actually built is in Weimar, so it's interesting for that aspect alone. And when you come down from the station, you cannot walk from the station really to the town centre without walking past it, and that's deliberate. They restructured the entire town. There used to be a great big viaduct with a sort of river going underneath and a park landscape, and they destroyed all of that, destroyed a lot of houses, resettled hundreds of people just to put that giant colossus of a Nazi party headquarters there. And that's something that really aggravated Weimarers as well, but it meant that they were trying to sort of stamp their own ideology onto Weimar without modifying the town centre itself too much.
So you then detail step by step the way the Nazis imposed their will, and especially the way Jews in Weimar begin to have their lives torn apart. How did ordinary Weimarers react to the new Nazi state?
Yeah, so that was something that I wanted to know kind of from the outset. One of the big questions is how do ordinary people respond to the violence, say, of the so-called Kristallnacht, of the November pogroms of 1938. Weimar only had 100 Jews, roughly. Which, as I say, about 35,000 people, of them 100 Jews, is not a huge population, and a lot of them are very, very assimilated and secularized. So you do have a Jewish religious community, but for instance, there's no synagogue. It's just not large enough for that. They go to Erfurt, which at the time was in Prussia, but quite close physically. So for the Nazis, there isn't really much to attack there. For example, on Kristallnacht, it's an odd moment where they're calling on all the local Nazis, go and destroy Jewish property, shops and synagogues, and the Weimar Nazis sit there and go, well, what do we do? There's not much here. And they turn on the last shop at that point that hadn't been Aryanized yet, and it's this poor old lady called Hedwig Hetemann, who, of all places, ran a little toy shop where she repaired dolls for the kids in Weimar, basically, and they all knew her because they'd take their broken toys to her and she'd repair them. And she's one of those examples, really highly assimilated, had converted to Protestantism very early on in life, had been married to a Protestant Weimarer who died, so she was widowed. And she was really well liked, you know, and so I was wondering how do people respond when there are basically Nazi thugs breaking into the shop of an old lady who repairs dolls for people, and the shocking reality is that nobody did anything to help her. They do come in, they drag all the stuff out and break it on the street. She comes out and pleads with them, and they just beat her, and she goes back into the house all frightened, and she completely, as a result of that experience, completely withdraws from public life. She doesn't even want to go to the dentist anymore, and eventually goes because she needs to have a tooth looked at. And the dentist later said that she was so frightened, even to come out and do that. And she said, of course I treated her, but at the same time, where were you on Kristallnacht? So I think it's in a way a sign of how people are perhaps willing to look the other way or try and ignore what's going on around them when it doesn't affect them directly.
So in 1937, Buchenwald is founded, and it's as a camp for political prisoners and various so-called undesirables. Buchenwald means beech forest, but that wasn't its original name. Why did the Nazis rename it?
Yeah, this is interesting because the only protest when they say they want to build a giant concentration camp on the outskirts of Weimar comes from the Nazi culture community, it's called. It's just like a local group. Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche is involved with them. So is the director of the Goethe Museum. It's kind of the cultural elite of Weimar and elsewhere in Germany as well. And they complain and they say, you can't name this by all means put it there, but you can't name it after Weimar or after the Ettersberg, which is the hill that it's based on, because that's so associated with Goethe, because he walked up there a lot and had picnics up there with his friends, wrote about the Ettersberg a lot. So it's really associated with Goethe, that hill. And so they say you can't name it after any of that. And interestingly, the Nazis listened to that. So you get a letter all the way up to Himmler, who's in charge of the SS and therefore of concentration camps, with that complaint. And Himmler says, fine, give it a different name then, if that's what the local Nazis kind of object to. And they just call it Beech Forest because it's a neutral name and Weimar can kind of wash its hands of it. But interestingly, it still gets a Weimar postcode, and it's still in other ways quite closely tied to the town.
How does that relationship evolve and work with Weimar businesses and the kind of infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, it's really close, as we said at the beginning, to Weimar, so it's really just a short walk away, and it hasn't got its own facilities to start with, and that goes all the way to where do you get your food from for the prisoners? Where do you get your wood, infrastructure, tools, that kind of stuff? So local businesses very quickly get into a business relationship with Weimar and supply Weimar with their goods. So I found butchers delivering meat up there for the kitchens. Even once the body count racks up, we should maybe briefly explain that this is not a death camp, because people often have this kind of Auschwitz image in their minds when they hear concentration camp. It's initially a work camp mostly for political opponents, and then after the November pogroms it becomes a holding camp for Jews as well, and for other, as you say, undesirables. But the point is that the Weimarers kind of almost convinced themselves that this is like an open-air prison sort of thing. They associate the very term concentration camp with the British use of it in the colonies. And so this is kind of sold to people as this is a clean, humane place where we put all the troublemakers. Weimarers know that that isn't the case because the body count does rack up really quickly. People die of diseases that are rampant in there, of being maltreated, of being outright murdered. Of torture, of all sorts of things, malnutrition. And ironically, the legislation that the Nazis themselves have put in for the cremation of bodies in 1934 says that you can only have cremation done by official state bodies, and because the SS isn't a state organization, ironically, neither are the concentration camps, they can't have to start with their own crematorium. So the bodies are taken down to the normal town crematorium, which is in the cemetery, which is in the middle of Weimar. And so people see these bodies being brought down on lorries in cheap wooden boxes en masse, and they also see the thick black plumes coming out of the crematorium, which is struggling to deal with the body count in there. You get to a point where the Weimar Town Council has to agree to buy a new crematorium for the normal civilian, cemetery in Weimar, because the other one can't cope with the amount of emaciated bodies anymore. And that's ordinary civilians sitting in the Weimar Town Council, not SS personnel. It's the mayor, it's people like that. And they agree to that. So they all know, because they get, the engineers report in, and the engineer says, well, you can't put one emaciated body after another in this crematorium. It's not built for that. You need a different type and more ovens, basically. And they agree to that. So there's always been this intricate relationship between the camp and the people in Weimar.
And there's another curious link with Weimar's recent history, that the on the gate it has a different motto to Arbeit macht frei, jedem das seine. Could you talk about how that came to be and what resonance that phrase has?
Yeah, so they set up the camp in 1937, and it's really basic still, and they just get the first prisoners in and basically try and see if there's people among the prisoners who can help build the facility in the camp and design things like buildings and furniture and stuff. And they find out, because they arrested some Bauhaus students and graduates as well, that they're obviously quite good at doing architecture and design and things. And they find one man among the prisoners called Franz Ehrlich, who's a Bauhaus graduate and sort of a communist activist as well. That's why he ends up in Buchenwald. And they find him in the quarry, and they say, well, maybe his services are better used in architecture, and they ask him to design the front gate for Buchenwald. And him being a Bauhaus graduate, he said later on, in his sort of memoirs, that he was always going to be a Bauhaus man, and that was all he ever wanted to be. So he designed the gate in a way that he knew how, and he used the Bauhaus font. And when you look at the posters that the Bauhaus movement designs early on, particularly for the Weimar exhibition of the Bauhaus in 1923, you can see the same, typography basically that is then used for the Buchenwald gate. And Ehrlich is also an interesting example for the moral complexity of this whole thing, because he is quite happy working for the Nazis in the camp because he's indoors, he's well fed, it's not as dangerous as the quarry. So he starts designing for the leadership things like a cradle for their son, and beds and furniture for the villa. And they are so happy with his work that they employ him after he's released from the concentration camp. They employ him as a civilian worker, and he carries on working for Buchenwald, lives in Weimar, gets married there, settles down. He later on even applies to get promoted. And, he's one of those examples of it's not as easy as to say Bauhaus good, Weimar, the Nazis bad, because there's so much overlap between them. The recent research has acknowledged that more. So there was a large exhibition in Weimar a couple of years ago that really highlighted that relationship between this kind of modernism, which the Nazis also quite liked elements of, and those kind of Bauhaus people who stayed in Germany and kind of then worked with the Nazis.
Well, there's another, I guess, more troubling aspect. I mean, the love of poets and thinkers, and how far that prepares the way for a kind of psychosis around ideas, an obsession with particular concepts. I don't know, and Weimar is the kind of perfect place for that. But just illustrate what jedem das Seine means.
So it's basically a translation from the Latin. It means each to their own, effectively. So the idea is that it sort of projects the idea that you deserve your fate when you're in there. So it's very different from Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes you free. The idea that there should be a message of hope there, if you only work hard enough. It's also completely cynical, of course, but the idea was that when you walk into the camp, you'd be facing Arbeit macht frei. And then you have this message, if you work hard enough, you'll get back out again. With the each to their own, it's the other way around. It faces inwards towards the roll call square. So it's telling prisoners who are in there, you deserve to be here. And this is a completely different thing. They actually, when researchers looked at the actual gate afterwards, they found that the coating, which was in red, the colouring of the letters, whilst the rest of the gate is white, they found that the coating of the letters had been done 8 times. So it had been repainted 8 times, so it would always be crimson red facing the prisoners, whilst the outside, facing the free world, as it were, had only been coated once when it was put up. So it tells you how important the Nazis themselves thought that messaging was to the prisoners inside.
I've stood on that parade ground, and you look out over the hills, and it's such a beautiful place. And I found it so, this thought that people would be, that they made everyone stand out there every morning, that as you turn around you could see over a really quite beautiful landscape. Yeah,
it's the only, Weimar itself is quite flat, and that hill is the only sort of elevation around Weimar, and you can actually see down there to the town. It's even today you can see the clock tower of Buchenwald down from the town centre. It's a really, really disturbing juxtaposition. Karl, my bookbinder, carries on going walking up there, hiking, sledging in the winter with his small son. Right at the time, for instance, as Fritz Ehrlich is sitting there, this is one of the kind of weird time coincidences that I found, is that he says in his diary, he went sort of sledging with my son today, and this was literally right at the time that Franz Ehrlich was sitting there in the camp, the Bauhaus graduate, designing the gate, just literally a couple of kilometers away from where Karl was sledging with his son.
No, it's a really hellish place. I think we've kind of got that picture that the moral collapse of Germany is kind of gathering pace. How does the story of Arthur and Rosa Schmidt, the owners of the Hotel Hohenzollern, which had always been a popular gathering place for Nazis right by the station, how does their story illustrate that moral collapse?
Yeah, so theirs is a really disturbing story. He is a Protestant man who comes from an old Weimar family, Arthur, and he marries Rosa Schmidt, who's from a Jewish background in Eastern Europe. They meet on a cruise ship, interestingly enough, before the First World War, because both of them want to go and see the world, and I guess that encapsulates that kind of Belle Epoque kind of spirit of the age before the First World War. And they marry and settle down in Alexandria, in British-controlled Egypt at the time. And the First World War basically crosses their plans. And this for me, is just such a bizarre thing in itself, how their lives would have unfolded very differently if it hadn't been for that. And then they settle in Weimar and set up the Hotel Hohenzollern together. It was quite a seedy kind of gambling den in the First World War, and then they turn it around and make it into quite a respectable, still humble, but respectable, clean establishment. And as you say, this becomes an early gathering point for the Nazis. Nobody knows that Rosa is Jewish because she's very assimilated, feels very German, is very almost kind of patriotic, nationalistic in outlook, as many middle-class German Jews were. Her son actually later on joins the Wehrmacht, because people just don't know that they are Jewish, and she just kind of feels German and doesn't really want anything to do with that. And Arthur also refuses when laws kick in eventually that you have to register Jewish members of the household. Later on, Jews are supposed to have either Sarah or Israel added to their names in the passports and the red letter J stamped into them. And Rosa still gets a passport in 1938 that hasn't got a J in it, or the added Sarah, so she keeps quite a low profile for a long time. And bizarrely, they host Hitler himself in the early years when Hitler can't afford to stay at the noble kind of, expensive elephant hotel. He stays in their hotel. So you imagine this Jewish woman sort of in the kitchen preparing food for Nazi gatherings and Hitler himself. And Hitler loves it so much he returns every time until he can afford to stay at the elephant. So this is one of those stories, really, and of course eventually it becomes more and more difficult, not least because of that Institute of Racial Science that is set up in Weimar as well, which gathers information about people's backgrounds. So the moment any of their children say they want to marry, or they want to join a club, or they want to join the Nazi party, they have to prove their Aryan lineage. So I strongly suspect, I haven't got the evidence to prove it, but I strongly suspect that her children didn't know that their mother was Jewish, because quite often that happened with highly assimilated mixed marriages, that they just didn't want their children to be affected by the anti-Semitic spirit of the age. But at one point, her daughter has got to apply for an Aryan passport, and the Nazis find out that Rosa is Jewish.
And there's this appalling, she's destroyed and taken to Auschwitz, but there's an absolutely terrifying, I found it almost the most heartbreaking moment in the whole book was Arthur, her husband's letter to the authorities, which reads like half like a normal letter about, I need to organise probate, so I need to know, need to sort of know how my wife died, sort of thing. And it just, and he gets nothing really. It's horrible. Yeah,
and it's also, he writes directly to the commandant of Auschwitz and asks for using Rosa's number, which everyone was given in the concentration camp, and saying, I heard that my wife had died here, can I have the death certificate? And he's also asking for her wedding ring and her coat. And that is quite telling, I find, because when we think of Auschwitz now at the end of the war, so we're talking 1944, we know what this place is like: abject chaos, pure violence. It's just most people on arrival get taken immediately to the gas chambers and are murdered in there. We know all of that. The fact that Arthur writes a letter there and says, can I have the wedding ring and everything back? He didn't know that all of this would have been stolen from her directly, and that there's virtually nothing left of his wife. And that in itself tells you how much people still clung to this idea that there must be some order, some legality to this whole thing. They were Germans after all. They're kind of used to this whole idea of everything being done properly and everything working according to rules. And the fact that even Arthur, after this terrible thing that's just happened to him, gets told that his wife had effectively been murdered, and he knows that. You can tell from the letter, the way it's written. He basically wants a death certificate because he doesn't believe that she died of natural causes. And he still writes this letter demanding her positions. So how, in parallel, how does the bookbinder Karl Weirich's story illustrate, I guess, what happens next, the final destruction of Nazi Germany at the hands of the Allies and of Weimar itself? Well, he is, in a way, I suppose, typical of the majority society in that he's not Jewish, he's not communist, he's also not a Nazi party member, so he does suffer some consequences for that, and that is some of the contracts that he held that were part of his income were cancelled and given to Nazi party members, that kind of thing. But on the flip side, he's hopeful in 1933 that Hitler will bring order and he will bring back prosperity. He briefly even becomes a patron member of the SS, which is sort of like you don't do any duties or anything for them, but you pay them some money to support them, and then quits that again as he becomes more disillusioned. But he goes on Nazi-funded holidays and kind of closes his eyes to all the terrible elements of it. Interestingly enough, when the pogroms happen in November 1938, he is actually appalled by them. And he does write, because he's quite religious as well, he writes in his diary that he feels that this is blasphemy, this will not end well. And that's a sentiment you find from a lot of people in Germany. But again, they don't do anything about it. They feel uneasy about it. They don't like the violence. Most of them are happy for Jews to be driven out. I should just add that. It's not an affront to the idea of this being unfair. They do want, a lot of them, Jews out of the economy and even out of the country, but they don't like the violence and the disorder of the whole thing. And he's quite appalled by that as well and becomes quite disaffected. And then the plans to remodel Weimar directly affect him. The Nazis basically tell him that his house is going to be torn down so that they can build a new Nazified colonnade there. And he thinks this is all completely over the top and becomes quite disillusioned with it. But still, that doesn't save him at that point. 1945, when Weimar is bombed, he's cowering under his own house in a basement together with his neighbours, and waits for the bombing to end and comes back out and finds his house and everything around him destroyed.
And his son is in the Wehrmacht. He's wounded several times and returns to be captured by the Americans. What happens to him?
Yeah, so the son is drafted. He's quite a bookish, sort of lanky boy, and once he turns 18, he's drafted into the Wehrmacht. And again, there's no resistance, as there wasn't from lots of Germans. It's not like he says, I'm not going, or his dad says you shouldn't go, or whatever. So he does his duty as he sees it. He flees from the American camp that they put him in. It's the so-called Rheinwiesenlager, which was a kind of open-air camp with pretty horrendous conditions in it. He flees from that and manages to get back home. And then Weimar and the whole of Thuringia become allocated to the Soviet zone of occupation as kind of a trade-off between the Allies. And that change in leadership really has a massive effect on Karl's life, because the Soviets just look around and it doesn't really matter whether you were drafted or not. If they found you in uniform, or if they found a uniform or anything in your house, or even if you were just a young man, they would be dubious about what you did. So his son Wilhelm is arrested and put into one of the concentration camps at Sachsenhausen, just outside of Berlin in his case, which was reused by the Soviets as a special camp, as they put it. So the NKVD just put anyone in there who they regarded as complicit in the Nazi regime, and Wilhelm ends up basically dying in there of the conditions that were there. So Karl afterwards does a lot of pondering about whether or not he could have saved his son's life in any shape or form.
In the final lines of Thomas Mann's novel Dr. Faustus, which basically covers this period in chronology, the narrator talks of a hope beyond hopelessness for Germany's future. How far does Weimar's story, which is kind of a story of catastrophe and renewal and catastrophe, resonate in Germany's present?
I think Weimar specifically, I think, is a bit overlooked in the way that Germany looks at this, because it has got such a central role where people focus on Munich and on Berlin and on the sort of big cities, Nuremberg, and how basically life changed there. I think even just in general, you get very little focus on kind of small town and rural life, but Weimar also, with its cultural status, I think hasn't received enough sort of attention there in that regard. But this whole period in and of itself, I think people keep returning to it, and in Germany especially they do, and look at it again and again from different angles, because I think we still haven't found, as historians or as a society, a specific answer to how this could happen. I think Weimar is a great place to look because of its stark contrasting patterns there, because it encapsulates all of that. But nonetheless, it's still a complicated answer to how did Germany end up, with all the ambition and the enthusiasm that was there in 1919, in the place that it was in 1939 or in 1945. And I think the answer that the Americans gave to that is completely understandable in 1945. I mean, Eisenhower stumbled upon one of Buchenwald's subcamps, Ohrdruf, and he looked at it and he thought, like, what is this? Even the Americans hadn't been able to sort of visualize the sheer horror of it, and to draw from that the conclusion that people lived next to this, so they must have known, is completely understandable in the context. And that generation, though, didn't want to have those discussions because they were still in it. They were still suffering from the consequences of that. I mean, Karl battles through the post-war years, from one day to the next. He's just trying to repair his house, trying to somehow live with the disappearance of his son. He only finds out later what happened to him. At no point does he sit down and think to himself, did I cause this? Or what was my role in this? And so my argument there is, that future generations, maybe our generation now because we're so far removed from it, need to look at this again in a different way and need to try and examine this in a way that isn't directly and closely linked to it.
How did the experience of researching for the book, did it impact the way you see the way others invoke the Weimar situation or Weimar as a kind of moral warning to the present? How did it change how you think of that story?
It did. I mean, the thing that got me to do this or kind of look at this time period in the first place is that there are so many comparisons drawn to it now. You get people calling each other sort of fascists, or people saying this and that politician is literally like Hitler, and you think, really? Literally? Because it's the ultimate moral weapon, isn't it? You get that out and you're kind of completely devaluing your political opponent's morals and intentions by doing that. But I don't think it's helpful in the sense that we're really learning something from history here. So to me, the question was, if there is something to be learned from it, what is it? And I don't really comment much on that in the book, because I sort of feel that if you take somebody like Karl, who's a bookbinder, and then you compare him to Elizabeth Nietzsche or to Baldur von Schirach, young aristocrat who ends up a key Nazi, they all have completely different forms of agency, different life situations, different reasons why they did what they did, and different opportunities to make decisions that affect the wider course of history. So to me, and the same is true today. So for me, someone who reads this, who's a bricklayer, who's going to approach that from a very different point of view compared to, say, a teacher or a doctor or a politician. So I wanted to open that entire human tableau up. For me, the key takeaway, if there is a universal one, is that people are very willing and able to close their eyes to the things that are happening around them that they feel uncomfortable about, because either they fear the consequences or they are so busy dealing with crisis after crisis in their own life and in, say, economic problems, wars. It's much easier to switch on Netflix than to sit through a news cycle and watch the whole thing and try and engage with it. And I feel that's what people like Karl did at the time. So when there's really quite disconcerting stuff happening around them, he goes hiking, for example. That's his retreat, and just to get away from things. And when you think what's happening in Weimar and suddenly you're out in nature in a forest somewhere on a hill, it all seems very far away and it's a psychological escape. But doing that, I think, with drawing means that you're opening spaces up for bad actors to kind of break, one taboo after another and sort of use the void that you leave behind by not resisting in a kind of small way. And I don't mean kind of grand gestures of resistance. I have got people in the book who do that, but it's always a minority, and I think it always will be. But I think if you engaged mentally, say, for example, with that old Jewish lady whose shop was being ransacked, you might be more willing to go to her the next day and say, can I help you put the shop back together or whatever. You wouldn't have got punished for that. But by saying it's none of my business, it's not my problem, you're kind of completely isolating her, and you're telling the Nazis it's okay to do that again the next time. Yeah,
and I think a real strength of the book is that you capture the way more elite people responding, more people who are in the know in a way, like Harry Kessler, who sort of has these discussions at a high level and can see is able to comment fluently on what Mussolini is doing and has all kinds of opinions about kind of the history, and then zooming back into people day to day who are just trying to have enough money to get bread. And I guess my final question would be, well, one striking discontinuity between what may or may not be happening in Europe now and 100 years ago is the violence, like the sheer willingness to use extreme violence to get what you want. And on the everyday, the assassinations, the thuggery, the brawling. There may be many reasons why we don't have that now, but we are an ageing society. And what struck me about the book is a lot of these people, apart from a couple of characters, are young and out there and are trying to make something of themselves, both good and evil. And I think that seems to be, ageing society is a very different relationship to political upheaval to a society like Germany in the interwar period.
Yeah, and we don't have that tabula rasa moment of the First World War being this abject catastrophe that happened to everyone. There isn't a single person in Western Europe, certainly, or actually the whole of Europe, that isn't affected by that in one way or another, in a really bad way. So almost everyone had seen death and violence on a scale that was just unfathomable. Even women, children, mortality rates go up. they don't have enough food, is bad. And then when that's over, people think, okay, we'll just start again now. And there's that dizzy hedonism going on all sorts of levels. There's a dance craze all across Germany, so that the authorities even think about banning dancing for a moment. All of this sort of stuff is there. That I don't think that compares in any way to this almost fatigue, I think, that we're maybe feeling now with the world and with the way that things are going. And the other thing is the violence. I mean, when you think even Weimar 1926, you have a policeman just shot on the open street in front of Rosa's Hotel, actually, in front of the Hohenzollern. And yes, people are shocked by that, and there's this heated debate about how to deal with it, but ultimately it's one of many events like it. I mean, we had former ministers being assassinated. You have regular uprisings in towns. Even in parliament, people use chairs and beat each other up with them. There's one example I got in my previous book, Beyond the Wall, where there's a communist deputy and he can't walk anymore because somebody deliberately broke his kneecap in parliament. And you think, as rowdy as it gets today, we're not anywhere near those sorts of levels of tolerating violence. And people forget how crucial a strand that is in the rise of the Nazis, because there's always this thing about Hitler getting elected into power, and that's true. But he never got kind of an outright majority in parliament, and to legally change the system from a democracy to a dictatorship, to pass this enabling act, he could only do that by the threat of violence. He was arresting, murdering and intimidating political opponents to a point where he artificially creates a majority. And I just don't see that anywhere today, as much as we've, got a situation now where people feel it's getting very heated politically. Parties by and large don't walk around with private armies numbering in the millions.
And if you watch, say, a film like Nosferatu by Murnau from, I think, 1923, you see a document of a society that really does, at least part of it, feels utterly diseased. And but it's like this sense of, the story of the kind of good bürgerliche chap his life being destroyed by this kind of creeping. And you see these street scenes of ruins, Lübeck, and you think this is a society of cripples and diseased people.
Yeah, that's right. And it really, I think, affected people because they compared it to 1914 and to what in hindsight then began to seem like, there was complete stagnation politically speaking before the war, but that begins to seem as a perfect, golden, prosperous, peaceful society to people, and they long for something like that back, and they begin to associate democracy and the squabbles and the arguments with this instability and that creeping sense of darkness. And you can see that even in what we now perceive to be the sort of heights of modern culture and modernism at the time, but even that's kind of infused with this darkness and with the sense of chucking out the old and overcoming it and bringing something completely new. And
of course, Threepenny Opera is full of kind of really nasty feeling in some of the music. But anyway, I think on that rather pessimistic note, thanks, Katja, for coming on. That was really fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the EI podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please sign up to our mailing list and download the Engelsberg Ideas app. Explore intelligent perspectives on history, culture and geopolitics anytime, anywhere. And best of all, it's totally free. Until next time, thanks for listening.